This is Wayne from My Tech News, and in today's video, I'm going to be talking about my experiences with the iPad Air 3, and these experiences are going to be after a month and a half. I've owned this tablet now for roughly a month and a half. Just take note, in this video, it's not going to be a full review of this tablet specifically. I'm just going to be pretty much talking about some stuff I've discovered after owning this tablet for about a month and a half, because I've already done a full review of the iPad Air 3, and at this point a lot of people already did reviews of this tablet in general, so there's really no need for me to re-talk about everything this tablet does have to offer. It's just going to be all my feelings and thoughts about this tablet, all my feelings and thoughts about iPads in general and tablets in 2020, and also, as of the recording of this video, the date I post this is still going to be the date where you can actually still buy this brand new from Apple. It's still in their current iPad lineup for early 2020, at least the iPad Air 3. So let's go ahead and talk about my thoughts and opinions on the iPad Air 3. So you can see right here, here is the iPad Air 3. The iPad Air 3 I have right here is the space gray model with 64 gig Wi-Fi only. That's the one I've been rocking right here. So nothing really too crazy. Basically what I'm rocking here is the base iPad Air 3 64 gig, and this one is going to be roughly $500 for the base iPad Air 3. If you want to buy the iPad Air 3, it's the second one in the lineup for this year, at least early 2020. They still do sell this one, so that's actually very interesting that they sell this one. And so far, my thoughts and opinions on tablets pretty much stayed the same. I am an avid tablet user, and I have used a lot of tablets in the past, so it's not like this is my first ever tablet that I've ever owned in my life. I've owned Android tablets, I've owned iOS tablets such as iPads, of course, and yeah, I've pretty much been through a lot of different tablets in my lifetime so far. And what I can say is, coming from a tablet person who really does still kind of enjoy tablets, and I still think there is kind of a niche audience for tablets, I really do think that no matter what you say, in my opinion, I still think iPads are still the way to go in 2020 if you're looking for a tablet. I don't think there's any Android tablet that's going to give you the same experience that Apple's tablets that run iOS are going to give you. So without a doubt, Apple does make the best tablets on the market, and it's actually really funny coming from a person that really enjoys Android more than iOS. I'm actually saying that, but that is just the sad truth and the sad reality that we live in, that Android tablets are just not that great. So you're pretty much looking at the iPad if you want a more traditional tablet that runs a mobile OS that's really tailored towards interactions with your fingers and things like that. That's really meant to be an on-the-go device. So yeah, I would definitely recommend an iPad. And after using this iPad for a very long time now, like I said, a month and a half, I really realized something as well. One thing that I really do realize about this iPad is just the fact that it really does prove nowadays you don't need to spend the most amount of money to get the best iPad that Apple does have to offer, like the iPad Pros that Apple currently offers, or even something like the iPad Air. It really does prove you can probably buy the base iPad, which I think is the iPad Air, or excuse me, not the iPad Air. Again, I want to say it's not the iPad Air. The base one is going to be the iPad 7th generation. I do believe that's what Apple officially calls it for early 2020, and I do think a lot of people could get away with that tablet as being their main tablet, just due to the price being really low, and for what a lot of people do on tablets, I think it's not really worth it to buy something like this. This one still is good, don't get me wrong, and it is better than something like the iPad 7th gen, but you're not really getting more for your money, not that much more compared to the iPad 7th generation. It really does show that there's really no reason to be paying a lot of money for these tablets. I can see maybe somebody like a person who has to do a lot of work, maybe trying to buy like an iPad Pro and maybe replacing like a laptop in some instances. But in general, I just don't see a lot of people actually trying to buy something like an iPad Pro and doing the same stuff you would normally do on an iPad. I just think it's really not worth it. And that's where it really shows that having a lineup of different iPads isn't really necessary. But again, it's still nice to have different iPads at different price points as well, because it does give you kind of like icing on the cake, or it's kind of like a dessert. It's nice to have that little extra features to your iPad that would be great with your iPad, but not really necessary. And primarily what I use my iPad for, I pretty much do a lot of the same stuff that a lot of other people do with their iPads. Like for instance, I do a lot of multimedia stuff, so I'm doing like web browsing, I'm doing like video watching, just that kind of stuff, which I think a lot of people do with tablets, and that's what their primary focus is. Sure, you can do other stuff with tablets, like you can do like take notes, or if you need to like play games, you can play games and things like that, but for the most part you're going to be doing just simple internet web-based tasks with a tablet, because that's its primary goal. However, I have been doing uh some pretty good video editing on my iPad for sure. I've been doing some video editing with the program that's pre-installed with the iPad. I want to say iMovie, and it's worked very good. I haven't done anything too intensive or too crazy when it actually comes to video editing, but this thing will definitely handle video editing like a champ, and it's actually pretty fun to video edit. I will say it's not the best, just because you don't have a mouse and keyboard to use, so it's not the best experience. But what I will say from that experience, if you're looking to do some light to maybe medium video editing, this will get the job done right away. And then talking about this, one thing I love about iPads after not having an iPad for so long is the fact that iPads literally have some of the best battery of any device out there. They're absolutely monsters. I love how many days I can get on this if I don't use it every day, or if I only browse the internet or watch video a couple hours a day, I can get like 3, 4, 5 hours of 3, 4, 5 days of usage out of the iPad, to make that clear. I love that about the iPad. And then also the standby time is very crazy. If I turn off the screen and leave it on like a table for a couple of days, I come back, the battery is absolutely only losing like 0% battery, or in some cases 1% battery. It's very amazing. So if you need a device that's just going to hold up over time when it comes to battery life, Apple, you won't be disappointed with. And this is not my first iPad. I've owned other iPads. I owned an iPad Air 1 way back in the day. And then I also owned an iPad Mini 4, which was actually my last tablet that I actually owned, period. The iPad Mini 4 from like 2015 or 2016. And what I will say is, if you are trying to decide on a tablet after using this, I really do end up liking the bigger size screen when it actually comes to the iPad or a tablet in general. I'm not really a fan of a 7 or 8-inch tablet, just because, well, you look at smartphones now in 2020, and smartphones just keep on getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and with so many people starting to get bigger smartphones, it just really doesn't make sense to buy a small tablet like an iPad mini, which Apple still sells. Or if you buy something like maybe one of the Kindle Fires that are only like 7 or 8 inches, honestly, I would go bigger the better. Maybe not necessarily the biggest one they offer, since it's extremely expensive and it is extremely big, but maybe one of the middle grounds is very nice. And I'm actually really glad in 2020 Apple finally realizes that there's more you can do with the iPad than something like the iPhone. So they want to push the boundaries by giving you a slightly bigger screen. So with the base model, you get a 10.2 inch screen, and with the iPad Air 3, which I currently have in my hands, you get a 10.5 inch screen. And I really do love the screen on this thing. I will say the screen's not mind-blowing or crazy, because I think it's only 1080p, and then on top of that, it's only LCD technology. It still kind of boggles my mind, after so many iterations of the iPad, Apple really hasn't changed the resolution, or really changed the type of screen on the iPads. It's still practically the same screen you may have seen on older iPads even many years ago. So that's actually very interesting. And in some cases, the screen actually, to my eye, doesn't look the best. Like, again, it's not the worst thing on the market, and it's far from bad. It's actually a very good LCD panel, but in some situations, I really do wish Apple would move away from things like LCD to maybe like OLED and things like that, because I'm spoiled when it comes to my smartphones and when it comes to my TVs having really good displays. And nowadays, this technology is kind of outdated depending on what device you use. So that's really my only gripe. I wish they would upgrade the actual display on this thing. The one thing I really never knew I was actually going to like a lot are black bezels on a device. Now, when it comes to me choosing this, I really didn't have a say on what type of color I was actually going to get, but I ended up getting Space Gray, and Space Gray I think is the only one, at least with the iPad Air 3, that actually doesn't have any white border on the bezels on the front. It has black bezels, which is actually very convenient and very nice, just because, well, when you're watching stuff on the screen like video or when you're browsing the web, it kind of blends in a little bit better. But I will say white is still a nice color, since I mostly owned white tablets in the past. Like, I owned some Samsung tablets that had white bezels. I've owned 2 iPads that have white bezels, so it's really personal preference. But I personally like black after using black for like literally my second or third tablet. I really do like this black bezels, because it makes the bezels more smaller and they're less notable, especially when you are watching stuff on the screen of the actual device. And then outside of that, the actual experience with iOS are now called iPadOS 13. I will have to say that it is a fairly enjoyable experience, but what I will say with this tablet, to be honest, if you owned an iPad in the past, and you're thinking about buying a new one to upgrade, or maybe you haven't owned one before, what I will say is that Apple really hasn't changed the game. It's pretty much the same iPad that you may have used many years ago. So if you're coming from an older iPad to this iPad, you won't really notice all the differences in iOS, because it's practically the same iOS you may have used before in the past. It's just that they do give it some more like really nice improvements to the experience, to give you some features that are specific to the iPad line of devices, or to iOS on iPads. So that's very nice. Like, for instance, one of the biggest key features that this has over something like the iPhone line that's running practically the same operating system is going to be a true multitasking with things like split view. Split view is definitely something that I personally really do enjoy and really do use on a day-to-day basis. I just love the fact you can have 2 apps open literally at the same time, and I really do think it's mind-blowing. So let me go ahead and open up, like, for instance, there's Safari, open up the tray at the bottom, and let's go ahead and open up something like Reddit. Slide it over, and boom, now I can actually have 2 applications at the same time. And this is where I really do think the bigger screens of the iPad are really handy if you do a lot of true multitasking. Maybe you have notes on one side and then a web browser on the other side. And these devices, even though I still really do think that these are pretty much just blown up iPhones on a bigger screen, what I can say is I think they're really good for people who need to take notes or in school and things like that with these big screens. And these things are very portable. They're very light. In most cases, they're going to be lighter than your average laptop. So that's actually very good. And like I said, I'm very glad, especially for someone like me who really does do true multitasking. I personally like the bigger screen. I think 10.5 is actually a really good size. Even with the base iPad having 10.2, it's definitely a step up besides 9.7. And it is always nice too, especially for me, which I do a lot of multimedia consumption, especially video watching, whether I'm on YouTube, whether I'm on Twitch, whether I'm on Netflix, Disney Plus, Hulu, etc. I really do like having that little bit of extra room. 10.2 from like a normal iPad back in the day from 9.7 may not really seem like a big deal, but if you're in videos all the time, or if you're doing true multitasking, like I said again, it is very nice to have that extra space on the actual iPad. One other thing that I wanted to talk about as well, going back to iOS, I talked about it before, but this thing literally just feels like a blown up iPhone, which time and time again is the really only thing that I don't necessarily hate about iPads, but just the fact it is kind of true that these are pretty much just blown up iPhones. It does kind of suck, and I can see why so many people just do not want to buy an iPad anymore, because it used to be a really revolutionary thing when they first came out, because we really never seen this type of technology, and it was very refreshing to get the iPad line. But after having the iPad line now for about 10 years, it's like, well, what are they really doing with this that really differentiates the experience from something like this? to the iPhone line, which the iPhone is pretty much just a smaller version of this. Granted, this one still does have more features because you do have a bigger screen, so they are implementing stuff like split view and a whole bunch of other stuff to kind of take advantage of the bigger screen. But outside of that, it's still just the same iOS experience you had way back in the past, and that's something I can truly say. And honestly, I can also say this as well: if I never actually had this device, or I never got this device, I would be 100% okay with using things like my laptop, my desktop, my smartphone, even though this is a middle ground and it is something much more, let's say, much more portable than something like your traditional laptop. I can see myself just not using this every day because I already have a smartphone in my pocket. Sure, the smartphone doesn't have the same type of display. It doesn't have a big, beautiful display like this, but just the fact that I can take my smartphone with me wherever I am in my pocket and not have to worry about lugging this thing around and things like that really kind of makes me wonder why Apple even still makes this. But I still think there is a market for a device like this, especially if you do a lot of multimedia stuff, or maybe you take notes, or you just want a bigger display. There are reasons for the iPad line to still exist, and I am glad Apple keeps updating the iPad line, it seems like, every year, and these are still good devices. One thing I did notice about the iPad Air 3, which is something that kind of bothers me a little bit, it will depend on person to person, and some people may not be bothered by this, but one thing that actually does bother me about the iPad Air 3 is the fact that it only has a 60 hertz display. Let me go ahead and go into Reddit, and let me go ahead into Twitch. I meant not Reddit, but Twitch. This is like literally my best example. I'm sure there's other examples, but this one I found to be one of the worst experiences to demo the display. Unfortunately, you may not see this on camera depending on what type of display you're using, through the power of the internet, yada yada yada. You get my point. But basically, my one problem with the iPad Air 3 to my eyes is I'm starting to actually notice the fact that 60 hertz nowadays is just not good enough for a lot of different scenarios. And when I start browsing this, you may actually notice that this thing starts to get kind of choppy when you actually start to browse. It's not the most smoothest thing in the world. And yes, I don't have any other applications actually in the background to actually bog this thing down and things like this. There may be those multitasking apps actually that I just actually throw up in the background, but even so, I have used this without any applications open in the background, and I have closed all of them, and it still kind of is not the greatest experience. It is kind of laggy, it is kind of choppy. It's not that bad, and it depends on what you're actually using, like what application, how many applications are open, because you do have to realize this thing only has 3 gig of RAM. Now, I'm not sure how this actually performed prior to iOS 13 or iPad OS 13, because this thing actually shipped with, I think, iOS 12 before iPad OS 13 was even a thing, and I never actually used this device prior to iPad OS 13 being installed, because I got this as a Christmas present, or a late Christmas present anyway, and I immediately installed iPad OS 13 on it to take advantage of all the new features of iPad OS 13. So I can't really say, and it will depend on different applications too. Sometimes stuff kind of like is kind of slow and kind of choppy, and sometimes it's not, but for the most part it's not bad. And if you're just taking your time, like scrolling really slow, you can't notice it, and it depends on everybody's eyes, because some people are more sensitive to frame rate skips, some people are more sensitive to like resolutions, colors on a screen, and things like that. But I did want to point that out up to this point, because I do think it kind of bothers me personally, but it's not enough for me not to use the tablet. I just really wanted to point that out as well. And yeah, I think that's pretty much going to wrap it up for this video. There's nothing I can really show you on the iPad besides your standard iPad. It's still the same iPad you may have used 10 years ago, and you may have used one of the iPad iterations. Overall, what I can say is, again, I've liked everything about my experience with the iPad. I'm still probably going to keep this iPad since I do use it quite often. It is nice to have that 10.5-inch screen. I love doing true multitasking. I love the fact that the battery in here is really big. I love the fact that the App Store is literally one of the best app stores to date on any mobile device. It has thousands, if not millions, of applications on it. I just love the experience on iOS. I can't wait to see where the future of tablets is headed, because know Apple is always trying to push the boundaries of what the iPad can do, and especially with something like iPad OS 13, Apple is really trying to make this a little bit more closer to like a laptop replacement, and really trying to make iOS kind of different on the iPad and things like that. And honestly, I would, if you buy this thing, you most likely won't be disappointed with your purchase. Sure, it's a very expensive tablet, but again, I don't think you'll feel bad about your purchase if you do end up buying this for yourself and things like that. But then again, it also does prove to me, looking at all three iPads again, that Apple does currently have in their lineup of iPads that really, for a lot of people, I think the base model is still just going to be fine. Sure, you're not getting icing on the cake features with like the iPad Air 3 or the current iPad Pro, but even so, I think for a lot of people, that's going to be the best iPad to buy. Or in some cases, maybe you're better off buying no iPad, to be honest, just because it's so similar to like a smartphone, no matter which smartphone you have. And there's also, I can see why there's no reason to actually own one of these and why these even exist in the first place. Anyway, guys, this is Wayne from My Tech News, signing out.